Welcome to the Security Events Trends video series. Over the course of this video, we will provide highlights on what we are watching across security events, including civil unrest, crime, war, and terrorism. We will discuss recent global incidents and our outlook for the next quarter. My name is Toby Wellner. I'm a senior analyst at Control Risks, and I'm joined here today by Alison Wood, head of intelligence at Seerist. Seerist is our strategic partner, and Seerist provides the only augmented analytics solution for threat and risk professionals. Fuses the best of human analysis really together with artificial intelligence. Before we share our outlook for the next quarter, can you walk me through, Alison, of the key trends we picked up in the last quarter? Are there any developments that will inform our analysis for the next quarter?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, in the first quarter of this year, Seerist intelligence team verified over 20,000 events of political violence and organized crime around the world. And when we say an event is verified, it means that one of our researchers has actually looked into a particular event or thing that's happened, which they usually get alerted to using the Seerist platform. And then they use a set methodology to both verify the source and capture different data points about an event. Which comprise a database that our control risk analysts or our clients can use to assess threats in an area or investigate different types of events. And maybe we can start with a few of the high-level trends across different event types that we saw this quarter, some of which were sort of continued from last quarter as well. So in Asia Pacific, we saw the most unrest events in this quarter of any other region. This was actually continued a trend that we saw last quarter. And this was driven in part or primarily by protest activity in India and Pakistan, as well as some other South Asian countries. However, we did see for the first time, or rather this quarter compared to last quarter, South Africa, Israel, France, and Lebanon move into the top 10 countries for unrest, which reflects notable protest movements in these countries, which we may talk a bit more about at some point. In terms of war, unsurprisingly, the war in Ukraine continues to drive the overall count of war events globally. And it's sort of the top country that we see for war events. This is sort of continued from last quarter as well. And we again saw Africa also lead regions in recording the highest number of terrorism events. Though we've seen some notable declines in events in certain areas that were previously hotspots for attacks in the fourth quarter last year. So Mozambique is a good example of this. We've also noted a decrease in the number of attacks in Afghanistan, sort of another historic hotspot for terrorism, but know that there's been an uptick in severe attacks there. So some data pointing in two different directions. So Toby, I know you work on the global issues team at Control Risks, and that focuses on transnational issues and trends. And I know that you've looked into the intersection of inflation and unrest in that team. So can you tell me a little bit about what you've observed in the first quarter of this year?
Sure. Thanks very much, Alice. So I think there's 3 points here on unrest and inflation. One, slow economic growth in China, the negative economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ongoing war in Ukraine. All of these factors have led to a significant increased global inflation rates over the last couple of months. The good news here is what we've seen in the first quarter is that international food prices have now returned to pre-Ukraine war levels. But, and I think this is important to highlight, high grain and fertilizer prices are still pushing up basic food prices in developing countries, including those in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. So in short, around the world, things are still much more expensive than they used to be, and people have certainly voiced their dissent about this. We recorded that more than 120 countries experienced inflation-related unrest since the beginning of 2022. And this trend also continues in this quarter, actually. In the first quarter of 2023, we recorded inflation-related unrest in 44 countries already. Most incidents so far took place in Pakistan, Kenya, India, and Iraq. And governments will continue to face mainly 3 dilemmas around this issue. First is high inflation rates and high food prices. For many governments, that's sort of out of their own control. Second, many governments are facing tight budgets already due to or as a result of spending bonanzas during the pandemic. Third is a strong US dollar, which made it much more expensive for many countries to actually pay off their debts. And so for many, all these dilemmas together will make it very difficult for governments to make decisions. They'll need to make tough policy decisions that will touch on subsidies, pensions, cost of living issues, all of this together. And Alison, I know that Seerist and Control Risk picked up a lot of incidents and developments around these issues. Which of these did you think were of particular interest or of particular concern to our clients?
Yeah, I mean, the points that you made were absolutely played out in the data that we've collected on unrest and the groups or issues driving it. So maybe a couple of examples from across the globe that I think are particularly relevant. So if we look at some of what's happened in Europe over the past quarter, obviously the French government's controversial pension reforms triggered strikes and protests in January, which continued really throughout the quarter. And then the latest sort of analysis that our analysts at Control Risk has said, they assess that forcing this reform through without holding a vote in Parliament has really damaged President Macron's government stability or credibility rather, and entrenched public discontent. And so we're expecting to see more protests over the coming months. So I do think that that's going to be a place to watch. And it's a place where we've received a lot of client interest because a lot of, companies have people or offices in Paris and other locations in France. And I think there's been a number of other cases around the globe where we've seen really mounting frustration from the public around, kind of to your earlier point, perceived government mismanagement of the economy or a lack of action around issues like inflation or rising food prices. We've seen this really across regions, but there have been a few noticeable cases in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, Latin America. And in several cases, we actually see opposition parties using these circumstances as an opportunity to rally support. So just pointing to a couple of examples here. Kenya is one. So unrest incidents or events actually more than doubled in the first quarter compared to last quarter and the end of last year. And this was driven primarily by opposition-led protests against the high cost of living and the current president. And the objective here was really to sort of leverage these protests as a way to gain political concessions. Similarly, or in a similar pattern, at least in Bangladesh, we've seen opposition parties like the Bangladesh Nationalist Party using high commodity prices in combination with things like power cuts to fuel public scrutiny of government policy, and this has fueled unrest. And in fact, in the wider Asia-Pacific region, we've seen about a third of protests have been related to the cost of living. So this is a really salient issue for publics across the world and is absolutely sort of being leveraged by political parties and opposition against governments that are currently in office. So I think this will, continue to be a thing to watch. Maybe one last example that's particularly dramatic. Demonstrators in Suriname in February actually attempted to storm the National Assembly in response to the government starting to phase out subsidies on fuel, gas, and electricity. And these cuts were made in accordance sort of with a mandate by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And so to your point, sort of given high interest rates and the general global economic picture, some of the things you mentioned, I know that sort of one of the things that you, Toby, and the wider analytical team will be watching is just the potential or indeed requirement in some cases for more governments to make these sort of cuts to stave off sort of mounting sovereign risks. And I think this is just going to continue to be a thing that fuels unrest over the next quarter. So, Toby, unrest is, of course, not the only focus of our analysis. And with the invasion of Ukraine last year, war scenarios have really suddenly moved up on many companies' security agendas. So what were the key trends here in the last quarter that you think people should really be looking out for?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. So first and foremost, we logged most of our war-related incidents this quarter again in Ukraine. However, it's been interesting to note that such incidents have also increased in Russia, actually. So regions bordering Ukraine have also been particularly affected now by war incidents. Russian officials claimed in December already last year that drone attacks destroyed aviation assets at military airfields as far as sort of 480 kilometers away from the border. And on the 20th of March, Ukraine claimed that Russian cruise missiles were destroyed by Ukrainian forces while being shipped by rail to Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And I know, Alison, will get back to our Ukraine outlook in a bit, but I wanted to also share some good news with you. So terrorism incidents continue to decline globally, which is great news. Mozambique, which ranked among the top countries for terrorism events in 2022, recorded a 63% decrease in attacks compared with the previous quarter. In Afghanistan, the number of terrorist attacks also decreased. However, Islamic State still remains active there. The group carried out a series of mass casualty, high-profile attacks, and will continue to seek to sort of increase attacks in the coming months to undermine the Taliban's authority as a security provider. In Cameroon, separatists also increased attacks to disrupt the Senate elections there, and in Pakistan, attacks increased as well. Here, terrorist incidents have surged, even though there's been a ceasefire agreement between the Pakistani Taliban and the government in November 2022. Alison, I feel like we've now talked enough about last quarter. Why don't we talk about what's ahead of us? So what are the things that our client need to consider in the next quarter?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I would point to is that we have a number of high-profile elections coming up around the globe. So Turkey and Thailand are both holding elections in May, and those will be sort of very high-profile with potential for sort of heightened unrest depending on the outcome of those elections. Sierra Leone is also holding an election in June. So those are all things that we're watching. There's also sort of an ongoing power crisis in South Africa. This is something we highlighted in the report a bit in this quarter as well, but we expect sort of load shedding power cuts, which have been going on for up to 10 hours a day in some places, to continue. The political opposition has already organized protests around this issue, and we continue sort of this issue to continue into the next quarter, and expect that a move to the next level of load shedding would likely spark some additional unrest. So that's another one to watch. Also kind of in the vein of unrest, would point to Israel as a country that we're watching. So obviously there have been widespread sort of mass protests in that country in response to judicial reforms or proposed judicial reforms. The parliament is going back into session at the beginning of next month, beginning of May, to resume sort of debate on that issue. And we expect protests to also resume around that time as well. We didn't talk a lot about crime today, but that is another sort of type of event, particularly organized crime, that we do track at Seerist. And there's been a couple noticeable shifts there in Latin America and Argentina and Colombia. We've seen an uptick in organized crime in some areas. So those are two countries I would say are worth watching over the next quarter as well. Toby, I guess I'll throw the question back to you. I mean, is there anything that the global issues team or the broader analysis team will be watching in particular over the next couple months?
Right. Yeah, I don't think we can do an outlook without talking about Ukraine here. And unfortunately, the outlook for the war in Ukraine remains pretty bleak. So despite Xi's visit to Russia and sort of reiterating the importance of peace negotiations, these will remain very unlikely in 2023. Ukraine will likely continue carrying out attacks within Russia, as we already earlier discussed. And sort of while fighting continues within Ukraine, the rest of the planet will also continue to feel the impacts of the war. The process of decoupling politically and economically from Russia will continue to sort of unravel the geopolitical order. Moscow, on the one hand, will seek even closer ties to Asia, while on the other hand, we'll see Western sanctions linked to the conflict will not be eased anytime soon and may even be expanded. And what's of interest here, especially in the next quarter and beyond, is that the US and the European Union will focus on secondary sanctions. So those are sanctions against entities and individuals in third countries. And they will also focus on enforcement mechanisms on countries that have significantly increased trade and financial transactions with Russia over the last year. That includes Armenia, China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Iran, India, Uzbekistan, and Turkey, just to mention a few here. We've also spoken about inflation and its global sort of aspects. And certainly in the next quarter, we'll be closely watching how an increasing number of countries are facing debt issues as servicing debt payments have become much more expensive due to a strong US dollar. Egypt, Burundi, El Salvador, Pakistan, Senegal, just to mention a few countries here, that are likely to face elevated sovereign debt risk in the coming months. And countries who are facing such pressures will be forced to adjust their spending. And at least some countries will probably have to cut down public spending, which for us as analysts is always like an early warning indicator for civil unrest and political instability risks. Lastly, let's not forget to talk about our so-called evergreen topics. So these will continue to impact companies globally next quarter, sort of no matter what. That's certainly US-China competition, increasing regulations and commitments to ESG, climate politics, and the ramification of the global economic slowdown.
Well, certainly no shortage of issues to track. And I guess I'll just remind everyone that, of course, the analysis that you and all of our brilliant colleagues author on these topics and more are available on Seerist, in addition to the data that we've talked about today and tracking events around the world. And of course, some of the open source analytics that we have on the platform as well. So I'm sure people want to know more about these subjects as they develop over the next quarter, and look forward to reading what you and the rest of the team have to say on them.
Thank you so much, Alison. We look forward to updating everyone next quarter on how the forecasted security trends could impact your organization. Thank you so much for watching. And of course, please do get in touch to find out more.